Welcome, crew. Welcome, crew, guys, gals, ghouls, friends, fiends, foes, whoever may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. Secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the Platas on Rocky Mountain High, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. It is Sunday, November 10th, Monday, November 11th, for those of you across the pond and beyond. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and thanks so much for joining us on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I'm your host, TessaTNT, and we are broadcasting live from the Mile High Clubhouse tonight. If you're listening live right now, you may be listening to us on Spreaker.com under We Are Paradox Media. You can also find us on KPNL Radio, which you can find at KPNL Radio at kpnl-db.com, eTalk Radio, which you can find on etalk.tv/radio, as well as YouTube, which you can find as well under We Are Paradox Media. If you want to listen in your free time, whether you're working it or working out, feel free to listen to us basically on any outlet that you listen to your podcasts on, and you should find us there. So, this evening we're doing story time with me, TessaTNT, and the book we are reading this evening is Stephen King's Insomnia. I don't know about you, but I have a bout of that. So it says on the cover, or the inner cover, Ralph Roberts has a problem. He isn't sleeping so well these days. In fact, he's hardly sleeping at all. Each morning, the news conveyed by the bedside clock is a little worse. 3:15, 3:02, 2:45, 2:15. The books call it premature waking. Ralph, who is still learning to be a widower, calls it a season in hell. He's begun to notice a strangeness in his familiar surroundings, to experience visual phenomena that he can't quite believe are hallucinations. Soon, Ralph thinks he won't be sleeping at all. And what then? A problem, yes, though perhaps... Here, let's go over here to these. Alright. Not so uncommon. You might say, Ralph has lived his entire life in Derry, Maine. And Derry isn't like other places, as millions of Stephen King readers will gladly testify. They remember it also set in Derry, and know there's a mean streak running through this small New England city. Underneath its ordinary surface, awesome and terrifying forces are at work. The dying natural and otherwise has been going on in Derry for a long, long time. Now Ralph is part of it, so are his friends, and so are the strangers they encounter. You, gentle reader, may never sleep again. Welcome to Insomnia. Alright. So, Stephen King lives in Bangor, Maine, with his wife, the novelist Tabitha King. He refuses to go into the cellar of his home, having come to believe that a velociraptor is waiting for him under the stairs by a fuse box, with his eyes gleaming and its nasty little claws outstretched. And the jacket is designed by Neil Stewart, and the author photograph by James Leonard. This is also available on audio cassette from Penguin Highbridge Audio. On the back, he's wearing a shirt that says, "We never sleep." You don't, do ya? Well, that's odd. I don't know if I could not ever sleep. That would really suck. I must say, it would be terrible. Alright, let's get into it. Prologue, Winding the Death Watch. 1. Old age is an island surrounded by death. That's by Juan Montalvo on Beauty. No one, least of all Dr. Litchfield, came right out and told Ralph Roberts that his wife was going to die. But there came a time when Ralph understood without needing to be told. The months between March and June were jangling, screaming time inside his head, a time of conferences with doctors, of evening runs to the hospital with Carolyn, of trips to other hospitals in other states for special tests. Ralph spent much of his travel time on these trips thanking God for Carolyn's Blue Cross major medical coverage. But personal research in the Derry Public Library, at first looking for answers the specialist might have overlooked, later on just looking for hope and grasping at straws. Those 4 months were like being dragged drunk through a malign carnival, where the people on the rides were really screaming. The people lost in the mirror maze were really lost, and the denizens of Freak Alley looked at you with false smiles on their lips and terror in their eyes. Ralph began to see these things by the middle of May, and as June set in, he began to understand that the pitchmen along the medical midway had only quack remedies to sell, and the cherry quick step of a calliope could no longer quite hide the fact that the tune spilling out of the loudspeakers was the funeral march. It was a carnival, all right, a carnival of lost souls. Ralph continued to deny these terrible images, and the even more terrible idea lurking behind them, all through the early summer of 1992, but as June gave way to July, this finally became impossible. The worst midsummer heatwave since 1971 rolled over central Maine, and Derry simmered in a bath of hazy sun, humidity, and daily temperatures in the mid-90s. The city, hardly a bustling metropolis at the best of times, fell into a complete stupor, and it was in this hot silence that Ralph Roberts first heard the ticking of the dead watch and understood that in the passage from June's cool damp greens to the baked stillness of July, Carolyn's slim chances had become no chances at all. She was going to die. Not this summer, probably. The doctors claimed to have quite a few tricks up their sleeves yet, and Ralph was sure they did, but this fall or this winter, his longtime companion, the only woman he had ever loved, was going to die. He tried to deny the idea, scolding himself for being a morbid old fool, but in the gasping silences of those long hot days, Ralph heard that ticking everywhere. It even seemed to be in the walls. Yet it was loudest from within Carolyn herself, and when she turned her calm white face toward him, perhaps to ask him to turn on the radio so she could listen while she shelled some beans for their supper, or to ask him if he would go across to the Red Apple and get her an ice cream on a stick, he would see that she heard it too. He would see it in her dark eyes, at first only when she was straight, but later even when her eyes were hazed by the pain medication that she took. By then, the ticking had grown very loud, and Ralph lay in bed beside her on those hot summer nights, when even a single sheet seemed to weigh 10 pounds, and he believed every dog in Derry was barking at the moon. He listened to it, to the death watch ticking inside Carolyn, and it seemed to him that his heart would break with sorrow and terror. How much would she be required to suffer before the end came? How much would he be required to suffer, and how could he possibly live without her? It was during this strange, fraught period that Ralph began to go from increasingly long walks through hot summer afternoons and slow twilight evenings, returning on many occasions too exhausted to eat. He kept expecting Carolyn to scold him for these outings, to say, "Why don't you stop it, you stupid old man? You'll kill yourself if you keep walking in this heat." But she never did, and he gradually realized she didn't even know. That he went out, yes, she knew that, but not all the miles he went, or that when he came home, he was often trembling with exhaustion and near sunstroke. Once upon a time, it had seemed to Ralph she saw everything, even a change of half an inch in where he parted his hair. No more. The tumor in her brain had stolen her powers of observation, as it would soon steal her life. So he walked, relishing the heat, in spite of the way it sometimes made his head swim and his ears ring. Relishing it mostly because of the way that it made his ears ring. Sometimes there were whole hours when they rang so loudly and his head pounded so fiercely that he couldn't hear the tick of Carolyn's death watch. He walked over much of Derry that hot July, a narrow-shouldered old man with thinning white hair and big hands that still looked capable of hard work. He walked from Witchman Street to the Barrens, from Kansas Street to Newbold Street, from Main Street to the Kissing Bridge. But his feet took him most frequently west along Harris Avenue, where the still beautiful and much beloved Carolyn Roberts was now spending her last year in a haze of headaches and morphine. To the Harris Avenue extension in Derry County Airport. He would walk out the extension, which was treeless and completely exposed to the pitiless sun, until he felt his legs threatening to cave in beneath him, and then double back. He often paused to catch his second wind in a shady picnic area close to the airport's service entrance. That night, this place was a teenage drinking and makeout spot, alive with the sounds of rap coming from boombox radios, but during the days, it was the more or less exclusive domain of a group Ralph's friend, Will McCrover, called Chess, to play gin or just to shoot the shit. Ralph had known many of them for years, had in fact gone to grammar school with Stan Eberly, and was comfortable with them, as long as they didn't get too nosy. Most didn't. They were old-school Yankees for the most part, and raised to believe that what a man doesn't choose to talk about is no one's business but his own. It was on one of these walks that he first became aware that something had gone very wrong with Ed Deepnew, his neighbor from up the street. Chapter 2. Ralph had walked much farther out to the Harris Avenue extension than usual that day, possibly because thunderheads had blotted out the sun and a cool, if still sporadic breeze had begun to blow. He had fallen into a kind of trance, not thinking of anything, not watching anything but the dusty toes of his sneakers, when the 4:45 United Airlines flight from Boston swooped low overhead, startling him back to where he was with the teeth-rattling whine of its jet engines. He watched it cross above the old GS and WM railroad tracks and the cyclone fence that marked the edge of the airport, watched it settle toward the runway, marked the blue puffs of smoke as its wheels touched down. Then he glanced at his watch, saw how late it was, and looked up with wide eyes at the orange roof of the Howard Johnsons just up the road. He'd been in a trance, all right. He had walked more than 5 miles without the slightest sense of time passing. Carolyn's time, a voice deep inside his head muttered. Yes, Carolyn's time. She would be back in the apartment, counting the minutes until she could have another Darwin complex. Excuse me. And he was out on the far side of the airport, halfway to Newport, in fact. Ralph looked up at the sky, and for the first time really saw the bruised purple thunderheads, which were stacking up over the airport. They did not mean rain, not for sure, not yet, but if it did rain, it was almost surely going to be caught up in it. There was nowhere to shelter between here and the little picnic area back by runway 3, and there was nothing there but a ratty little gazebo that always smelled faintly of beer. He took another look at the orange roof, then reached into his right-hand pocket and felt the little sheaf of bills held by the silver money clip Carolyn had given him for his 65th. There was nothing to prevent him walking up to Hojo's and calling a cab, except maybe for the thought of how the driver might look at him. Stupid old man, the eyes in the rearview mirror might say. Stupid old man, walked a lot further than he should have on a hot day. If he'd been swimming, he would have drowned. paranoid Ralph, and the voice in his head told him. And now its clucky, slightly patronizing tone reminded him of Bill McGovern. Well, maybe it was, and maybe it wasn't. Either way, he thought, he would chance the rain and walk back. What if it doesn't just rain? Last summer it hailed so hard that one time in August it broke windows all over the west side. Let it hail then, he said. I don't bruise that easy. Ralph began to walk slowly back toward town, along the shoulder of the extension, his old high tops raising small, parched puffs of dust as he went. He could hear the first rumbles of thunder in the west, where the clouds were stacking up. The sun, although blotted out, was refusing to quit without a fight. It edged the thunderheads with bands of brilliant gold, and shone through the occasional rifts in the clouds like the fragmented beam of some huge movie projector. Ralph found himself feeling glad that he had decided to walk, in spite of the ache in his legs and the steady nagging pain in the small of his back. One thing at least, he thought, I'll sleep tonight. I'll sleep like a damn rock. The ridge of the airport, acres of dead brown grass with the rusty railroad tracks sunken like the remains of some old wreck, was now on his left. Far in the distance, beyond the cyclone fence, he could see the United 747, now the size of a child's toy plane, taxiing toward the small terminal which United and Delta shared. Ralph's gaze was caught by another vehicle, this one a car, leaving the General Aviation Terminal, which stood at this end of the airport. It was heading across the tarmac toward the small service entrance, which gave on to Harris Avenue Extension. Ralph had watched a lot of vehicles come and go through the entrance just lately. It was only 70 yards or so from the picnic area where the Harris Avenue old crocs gathered. As the car approached the gate, Ralph recognized it as Ed and Helen DePnew's Datsun, and it was really moving. Ralph stopped on the shoulder and aware that his hands had curled into anxious fists as the small brown car bore down on the closed gate. He needed a key card to open the gate from the outside. From the inside, an electric I-beam did the job. But the beam was set close to the gate, very close, and at the speed the Datsun was going. At the last moment or so, it seemed to Ralph, the small brown car scratched to a stop, the tires sending up puffs of blue smoke that made Ralph think of the 747 touching down. And the gate began to trundle slowly, open on its tracks. Ralph's fisted hands relaxed. An arm emerged from the driver's side window of the Datsun and began to wave up and down, apparently haranguing the gate, urging it to hurry it up. There was something so absurd about this that Ralph began to smile. The smile died before it had exposed even a gleam of teeth, however. The wind was still freshening from the west, where the thunderheads were, and it carried the screaming voice of the Datsun's driver. You son of a bitch fucker! You bastard! Eat my cock! Hurry up! And lick shit, you fucking asshole! Cunt leopard! A fucking booger! Rat dick ring meat suckhole! That can't be Ed DePnew, Ralph murmured. He began to walk again without realizing it can't be. Ed was a research chemist at the Hawking Laboratories Research Facility in Fresh Harbor. One of the kindest, most civil young men Ralph had ever met. Both he and Carolyn were very fond of Ed's wife Helen, and their new baby, Natalie, as well. A visit from Natalie was one of the few things with the power to lift Carolyn out of her own life these days, and sensing this, Helen brought her over frequently. Ed never complained. There were men he knew who wouldn't have cared to have the missus running to the old folks down the street every time the baby did, some new and entrancing thing, especially when the granny figure in the picture was ill. Ralph had an idea that Ed wouldn't be able to tell someone to go to hell without suffering a sleepless night in consequence, but, you fucking whoremaster, move your sour shit-caked ass, you hear me, fucker cut rammer? But it sure sounded like Ed. Even from 200 or 300 yards away, it certainly sounded like him. The driver of the Datsun was revving his engine like a kid in a muscle car, waiting for the light to turn green. Clouds of exhaust smoke farted up from the tailpipe. As soon as the gate had retracted enough to allow the Datsun passage, the car leaped forward, squirting through the gap with its engine roaring, and when it did, Ralph got a clear look at the driver. He was close enough now for there to be no doubt. It was Ed, all right. The Datsun bounced along the short, unpaved stretch of lane between the gate and the Harris Street extension. A horn blared suddenly, and Ralph saw a blue Ford Ranger heading west on the extension, swerved to avoid the outcoming Datsun. The driver of the pickup saw the danger too late, and Ed apparently never saw it at all. It was only later that Ralph came to consider Ed might have rammed the Ranger on purpose. There was a brief scream of tires, followed by the hollow bang of the Datsun's fender driving into the Ford sidewall. The pickup was driven halfway across the yellow line. The Datsun's hood crumpled, came unlatched, and popped up a little. Headlight glass tinkled into the street. A moment later, both vehicles were dead in the middle of the road, tangled together like some weird sculpture. Ralph stood where he was for a time being, watching as oil spread beneath the Datsun front end. He had seen several road accidents in his almost 70 years, most of them minor, one or two serious, and he was always stunned by how quickly they happened and how little drama there was. It wasn't like in the movies where the camera could slow things down, or on a videotape where you could watch the car go off the cliff again and again, if you so choose. There was usually just a series of converging blurs, followed by that quick and toneless combination of sounds. The cry of the tires, the hollow bang of metal crimping metal, and the tinkle of glass. Then voila! Tout fini! There was even a kind of protocol for this sort of thing, how one should behave when involved in a low-speed collision. Of course there was, Ralph mused. There were probably a dozen 2-bit collisions in Derry every day, and maybe twice that number in the wintertime, when there was snow on the roads, and the roads got slippery. You got out, you met your opposite number at the point where the two vehicles had come together, and where, quite often, they were still entwined. You looked, you shook your heads, sometimes, often, actually. This phase of the encounter was marked with angry words. Fault was assigned, often rashly. Driving skills impugned, legal action threatened. Ralph supposed what the drivers were really trying to say without coming right out and saying it was, "Listen, fool, you scared the living hell out of me." The final step in this unhappy little dance was the exchange of the sacred insurance screeds. It was at this point that the drivers usually began to get control of their galloping emotions, always assuming that no one had been hurt, as appeared to be the case here. Sometimes the drivers involved even finished up by shaking hands. Ralph prepared to watch all of this from his vantage point less 150 yards away. But as soon as the driver's door of the Datsun opened, he understood that things were going to go differently here. That the accident was maybe not over, but still happening. It certainly did not seem that anyone was going to shake at the end of these festivities. The door did not swing open. It flew open. Ed Ticknew leaped out, then simply stood stock still beside his car, his slim shoulders squared against a background of deepening clouds. He was wearing faded jeans and a t-shirt, and Ralph realized that before today he had never seen Ed in a shirt that didn't button up the front. And there was something around his neck, a long white something. A scarf? It looked like a scarf, but why would anybody be wearing a scarf on a day as hot as this one had been? Ed stood beside his wounded car for a moment, seeming to look in every direction but the right one. The fierce little pokes of his narrow head reminded Ralph of the way roosters studied their barnyard turf, looking for invaders and interlopers. Something about that similarity made Ralph feel uneasy. He had never seen Ed look that way before, and he supposed that was part of it, but it wasn't all of it. The truth of the matter was simply this. He had never seen anyone look exactly like that. Thunder rumbled in the west louder now, and closer. The man getting out of the Ranger would have made 2 of Ed Ticknew, possibly 3. His vast, deep belly hung over the rolled waistband of his green chino work pants. There were sweat stains, the size of dinner plates under the arms of his open-throated sweatshirt. He tipped back the bill of the West Side gardener's gimme cap he was wearing to get a better look at the man who had broadsided him. His heavy-jowled face was dead pale except for the bright patches of color, like rouge high on his cheekbones, and Ralph thought, "There's a man who's a prime candidate for a heart attack. If I was closer, I bet I'd be able to see the creases in his earlobes." "Hey!" the heavyset guy yelled at Ed. The voice coming out of the broad chest and deep gut was absurdly thin, almost reedy. "Where'd you get your license? Fucking Sears and Roebuck?" Ed's wandering, jabbing head swung immediately toward the sound of that big man's voice. Seemed almost to home in, like a jet guided by radar. And Ralph got his first good look at Ed's eyes. He felt a bolt of alarm light up in his chest and suddenly began to run toward the accident. Ed, meanwhile, got started toward the man in the sweat-soaked white shirt and gimme cap. He was walking in a stiff-legged, high-shouldered strut that was nothing at all like his usual easy-going amble. "Ed!" Ralph shouted, but the freshening breeze, cold now with the promise of rain, seemed to snatch the words away before they can even get out of his mouth. Certainly Ed never turned. Ralph made himself run faster, the ache in his legs and the throbbing in the small of his back forgotten. It was murder he had seen in Ed Dupnew's wide, unblinking eyes. He had absolutely no previous experience upon which to base such an assessment, but he didn't think you could mistake such a naked glare. It was the look fighting cocks must wear when they launch themselves at each other, spurs up and lashing. "Ed! Hey, Ed, hold up! It's Ralph!" Not so much as a glance around, although Ralph was now so close that Ed must have heard, wind or no wind. Certainly the heavy-set man glanced around, and Ralph could see both fear and uncertainty in his look. Then the heavy-set turned back to Ed and raised his hands placatingly. "Look," he said, "we can talk." That was as far as he got. Ed took another quick step toward, reached up with one slim hand, was very white in the rapidly darkening day, and slapped heavy-set across his far from inconsiderable jowls. The sound was like the report of a kid's air rifle. "How many have you killed?" Ed asked. Heavyset pressed back against the side of his pickup, his mouth open, his eyes wide. Ed's queer stiff strut never faltered. He walked into the other man and stood belly to belly with him, seemingly oblivious of the fact that the pickup's driver was 4 inches taller and outweighed him by 100 pounds or more. Ed reached up and slapped him again. "Come on, fess up, brave boy. How many have you killed?" His voice rose to a shriek that was lost in the coming storm's first really authoritative clap of thunder. Heavyset pushed him away, a gesture not of aggression but of simple fright, and Ed went rolling backward against the crumpled nose of his Datsun. He bounced back at once, fist clenched, gathering himself to leap at Heavyset, who was cringing against the side of his truck and was, with his gimme cap not askew and his shirt untucked in the back and at all sides. A memory flashed across Ralph's mind, the Three Stooges short he'd seen years ago. Larry, Curly, and Moe playing painters without a clue, and he felt a sudden surge of sympathy for Heavyset, who looked absurd as well as scared to death. Ed Dupnew did not look absurd. With his yanked back lips and wide unblinking eyes, Ed looked more like a fighting cock than ever. "I know what you've been doing," he whispered to Heavyset. "What kind of comedy did you think this was? Did you think you and your butcher friends could get away with it for it?" At that moment, Ralph arrived, puffing and gasping like an old cart horse, and put an arm around Ed's shoulders. The heat beneath a thin t-shirt was unnerving. It was like putting an arm around an oven, and when Ed turned to look at him, Ralph had the momentary but unforgettable impression that that was exactly what he was looking into. He had never seen such utter, unreasoning fury in a pair of human eyes, had never even suspected such fury might exist. Ralph's immediate impulse was to recoil, but he suppressed it and stood firm. He had an idea that if he pulled back, Ed would fall on him like a rogue dog, biting and clawing. It was absurd, of course. Ed was a research chemist. Ed was a member of the Book of the Month Club, the kind who took the 20-pound histories of the Crimean War they always seemed to offer as alternates to the main selection. Ed was Helen's husband and Natalie's dad. Hell, Ed was a friend. Except this wasn't that Ed, and Ralph knew it. Instead of pulling back, Ralph leaned forward, grasped Ed's shoulders, so hot under the t-shirt, so incredibly throbbingly hot, and moved his face until it blocked Heavyset from Ed's creepy fixed gaze. "Ed, quit it," Ralph said. He used a loud but steadily firm voice he assumed one used with people who were having hysterics. "You're all right. Just quit it." For a moment, Ed's fixed gaze didn't waver, and then his eyes moved over Ralph's face. It wasn't much, but Ralph felt a small surge of relief just the same. "What's the matter with him?" Heavyset asked from behind Ralph. "He crazy, do you think?" "He's fine, I'm sure," Ralph said, although he was sure of no such thing. He spoke out of the corner of his mouth and didn't take his eyes from Ed. He didn't dare take his eyes from Ed. That contact felt like the only hold he had over the man, and a tenuous one at best. Just shaken up from the crash, he needs a few seconds to calm down. "Ask him what he's got under that tarp," Ed yelled suddenly, and pointed over Ralph's shoulder. Lightning flashed, and for a moment, the pitted scars of Ed's adolescent acne were thrown into sharp relief, like some strange organic treasure map. Thunder rolled. Hey, Susan Day," he chanted in a high, childlike voice that made Ralph's forearms break out in goosebumps. "How many kids did you kill today?" He ain't shook up, Heavyset said. "He's crazy, and when the cops get here, I'm gonna see he gets tooken in." Ralph glanced around and saw a blue tarpaulin stretched across the bed of the pickup. It had been tied down with bright yellow hanks of rope. Round shapes bulked beneath it. "Ralph?" a timid voice asked. He glanced to his left and saw Dorrance Mertzeller, a 90-something, easily the oldest of Harris Avenue old crocs, standing just beyond Heavyset's pickup truck. There was a paperback book in his waxy, liver-spotted hands, and Dorrance was bending it anxiously back and forth, giving the spine a real workout. Ralph supposed it was a book of poetry, which was all he had ever seen old Dorrance read. Or maybe he didn't really read at all. Maybe he just liked to hold books and look at the artfully stacked words. "Ralph, what's wrong? What's happening?" More lightning flashed overhead, a purple-white snarl of electricity. Dorrance looked up at it as if unsure of where he was, who he was, or what he was seeing. Ralph groaned inside. "Dorrance," he began, and then Ed lunged beneath him, like some wild animal, which was laying quietly only to regain its strength. Ralph staggered, then pushed Ed back against the crumpled hood of the Datsun. He felt panicky, unsure of what to do next or how to do it. There were too many things going on at once. He could feel the muscles in Ed's arms humming fiercely just below his grip. It was almost as if the man had somehow swallowed a bolt of lightning now loose in the sky. "Ralph?" Dorrance asked, in the same calm but worried voice. "I wouldn't touch him anymore if I were you. I can't see your hands." "Oh, good. Another lunatic to deal with. Just what he needed." Ralph glanced down at his hands, then looked at the old man. "What are you talking about, Dorrance?" "Your hands," Dorrance said patiently. "I can't see your... This is no place for you, Why don't you get lost?" The old man brightened a little at that. "Yes," he said, in the tone of one who has just stumbled over a great truth. "That's just what I ought to do." He began to back up, and when the thunder cracked again, he cringed and put his book on top of his head. Ralph was able to read the bright red letters of the title, Buck Dancer's Choice. "It's what you ought to do, too, Ralph. You don't want to mess with long-time business. It's a good way to get hurt. What are you..." But before Ralph could finish, Dorrance turned his back and went lumbering off in the direction of the picnic area, with his fringe of white hair, as gossamer as the hair on a new baby's head, rippling in the breeze of the oncoming storm. One problem solved, but Ralph's relief was short-lived. Ed had been temporarily distracted by Dorrance, but now he was looking daggers at Heavyset again. "Cunt liquor," he spat. "Flecked your mother and licked your cunt." Heavyset's enormous brow drew down. What? Ed's eyes shifted back to Ralph, whom he now seemed to recognize. Ask him what's under that tarp, he cried. Better yet, get the murdering cocksucker to show you. Ralph looked at the Heavyset man. What have you got under there? What's it to you? Heavyset asked, perhaps trying to sound truculent. He sampled the look in Ed DeMue's eyes and took 2 more sidling steps away. Nothing to me, something to him, Ralph said, lifting his chin in Ed's direction. Just help me cool him out, okay? You know him? Murderer, Ed repeated, and this time he lunged hard enough under Ralph's hands to drive him back a step. Yet something was happening, wasn't it? Ralph thought the scary, vacant look was seeping out of Ed's eyes. There seemed to be a little more Ed in there than there had been before. Or perhaps that was only wishful thinking. Murderer, baby murderer. Jesus, what a Looney Tune, Heavyset said. They went to the rear of the truck bed, yanked one of the ropes free, and peeled back the corner of the tarpaulin. Beneath it were 4 pressboard barrels, each marked Weedgo. Organic fertilizer, Heavyset said, his eyes flicking from Ed to Ralph and then back to Ed again. He touched the bill of his West Side gardener's cap. I spent the day working on a set of new flower beds outside the dairy site wing, where you could stand a short vacation, friend. Fertilizer? Ed asked. It was himself he seemed to be speaking to. His left hand rose slowly to his temple and began to rub there. Fertilizer? He sounded like a man questioning some simple yet staggering scientific development. Fertilizer, Heavyset agreed. He glanced back at Ralph and said, This guy is sick in the head. You know it? He's confused, that's all, Ralph answered uneasily. He leaned over the side of the truck and wrapped a barrel top. Then he turned back to Ed. Barrels of fertilizer, he said. Okay. No response. Ed's right hand rose and began to rub at his other temple. He looked like a man sinking into a terrible migraine. Okay, Ralph repeated gently. Ed closed his eyes for a moment, and when they opened again, Ralph observed a sheen in them he thought was probably tears. Ed's tongue slipped out and dabbed delicately, first at one corner of his mouth and then the other. He took the end of his silk scarf and wiped his forehead, and as he did, Ralph saw there were Chinese figures embroidered on it in red, just above the fringe. I guess maybe, he began and then broke off, his eyes widening again, and that look Ralph didn't like. Babies, he rasped. You hear me? Babies! Ralph shoved him back against his car for the 3rd or 4th time. He'd lost count. What are you talking about, Ed? An idea suddenly occurred to him. Is it Natalie? Are you worried about Natalie? A small, crafty smile touched Ed's lips. He looked past Ralph at the heavy-set man. Fertilizer, huh? Well, if that's all it is, you won't mind opening one of them, will you? Heavyset looked at Ralph uneasily. Man needs a doctor, he said. Maybe he does, but he was calming down, I thought. Could you open one of those barrels? It might make him feel better. Yeah, sure, what the heck. In for a penny, in for a pound. There was another flash of lightning, another heavy blast of thunder, one that seemed to be rolling all the way across the sky this time. And a cold spackle of rain struck the back of Ralph's sweaty neck. He glanced to his left and saw Dorrance and Martzeller standing at the entrance of the picnic area, book in hand, watching the 3 of them anxiously. It's gonna rain a pretty bitch, looks like, Heavyset said, and I can't let this stuff get wet. It starts a chemical reaction, so look fast. He felt around between one of the barrels and the sidewall of his truck for a moment, then came up with a crowbar. I must be as nutty as he is doing this, said Ralph. I mean, I was just going along home, minding my business. He hit me. Go on, Ralph said. It'll only take a second. Yeah, Heavyset replied sourly, turning the flat end of the crowbar under the lid of the nearest barrel. But the memories will last a lifetime. Another thunderclap rocked the day just then, and Heavyset did not hear what Ed DeMue said next. Ralph did, however, and it chilled the pit of his stomach. Those barrels are full of dead babies, Ed said. You'll see. Heavyset popped the lid on the end barrel, and such was the conviction in Ed's voice that Ralph almost expected to see tangles of arms and legs and bundles of small hairless heads. Instead, he saw a mixture of fine blue crystals and brownstone. The smell which rose from the barrel was rich and peaty, with a thin chemical undertone. "See? Satisfied?" Heavyset asked, speaking directly to Ed again. "I ain't Ray Gilbert, or that guy Dahmer after all. How about that?" The look of confusion was back on Ed's face, and when the thunder cracked overhead again, he cringed a little. He leaned over, reached a hand toward the barrel, then looked a question at Heavyset. The big man nodded to him, almost sympathetically. Ralph thought, "Sure, touch it, fine by me. But if it rains, while you're holding the fistful, you'll dance like John Travolta. It burns." Ed reached into the barrel, grabbed some of the mix, and let it run through his fingers. He shot Ralph a perplexed look. There was an element of embarrassment in that look as well, Ralph thought, and then sank his arm into the barrel all the way to the elbow. "Hey!" Heavyset cried, startled. "That ain't a box of Cracker Jack!" For a moment, the crafty grin resurfaced on Ed's face. A look that said, "I know a trick worth two of that." And then it subsided into puzzlement again as he found nothing farther down but more fertilizer. When he drew his arm out of the barrel, it was dusty and aromatic with the mix. Another flash of lightning exploded above the airport. The thunder which followed was almost deafening. "Get that off your skin before it rains, I'm warning you," Heavyset said. He reached through the Ranger's open passenger door and produced a McDonald's takeout sack. He rummaged in it, came out with a couple of napkins, and handed them to Ed, who began to wipe the fertilizer dust from his forearm, like a man in a dream. While he did this, Heavyset replaced the lid on the barrel, tamping it into place with one large, freckled fist, and taking glances up at the darkening sky. When Ed touched the shoulder of his white shirt, the man stiffened and pulled away, looking at Ed warily. "I think I owe you an apology," Ed said, and to Ralph his voice sounded completely clear and sane for the first time. "You're damn tootin'," Heavyset said, but he sounded relieved. He stretched the plastic-coated tarpaulin back into place and tied it in a series of quick, efficient gestures. Watching him, Ralph was struck by what a sly thief time was. Once, he could have tied that same sheet band with the same dexterous ease. Today, he could still tie it, but it would take him at least 2 minutes and maybe 3 of his best curse words. Heavyset patted the tarp and then turned to them, folding his arms across the substantial expanse of his chest. "Did you see the accident?" he asked Ralph. "No," Ralph said at once. He had no idea why he was lying, but the decision to do it was instantaneous. "I was watching the plane land, the United." To his complete surprise, the flesh patches on Heavyset's cheeks began to spread. "You were watching it too?" Ralph thought suddenly. "And not just watching it land either, or you wouldn't be blushing like that. You were watching it taxi." This thought was followed by a complete revelation. Heavyset thought the accident had been his fault, or that the cop or cops who showed up to investigate might read it that way. He'd been watching the plane and hadn't seen Ed's reckless charge through the service gate and out of the extension. "Look, I'm really sorry," Ed was saying earnestly, but he actually looked more than sorry. He looked dismayed. Ralph suddenly found himself wondering how much he trusted that expression, and if he really had even the slightest idea of, hey, Susan Day, what had just happened here, and who the hell was Susan Day anyhow? "I bumped my head on the steering wheel," Ed was saying, "and I guess it rattled my cage pretty good." "Yeah, I guess it did," Heavyset said. He scratched his head, looked up at the dark and convulsing sky, then looked back at Ed again. Want to make you a deal, friend?" "Oh, what deal is that?" "Let's just exchange names and phone numbers instead of going through all the insurance shit. Then you go your way and I go mine." Ed looked uncertainly at Ralph, who shrugged, and then back at the man on the West Side gardener's cap. "If we get into it with the cops," Heavyset went on, "I'm in for a ration of shit. First thing they're going to find out when they call it in is I had an OUI last winter, and I'm driving on a provisional license. They're out to make problems for me even though I was on the main drag and had the right-of-way. See what I mean?" "Yes," Ed said. "I guess so, but the accident was entirely my fault. I was going much too fast." They accident part is maybe not so important, Heavyset said, then looked mistrustfully around at an approaching panel truck that was pulling over onto the shoulder. He looked back at Ed again and spoke with some urgency. You lost some oil, but it stopped leaking now. I bet you could drive her home. If you live here in town. You live here in town? Yes, Ed said. And I'd stand you good on repairs, up to $50 or so. Another revelation struck Ralph. It was the only thing he could think of to explain the man's sudden change from truculence to something close to wheedling. An OUI last winter? Yes, probably, but Ralph had never heard of such a thing as a provisional license and thought it was almost certainly bullshit. Old Mr. Westside Gardeners had been driving without a license. What complicated the situation was this. Ed was telling the truth. The accident had been entirely his fault. If we just drive away and call it good, Heavyset was going on, I don't have to explain all over again about the OUI, and you don't have to explain why you jumped out of your car and started slapping me and yelling about how I had a truckload of dead bodies. Did I actually say that? Ed asked, sounding bewildered. You know you did, Heavyset told him grimly. A voice with wispy French-Canadian accent asked, Everything okay here, fellers? Nobody hurt? Hey, Ralph, that you? The truck which had pulled over had Dairy Dry Cleaners printed on the side, and Ralph recognized the driver as one of the Vacone brothers from Old Cape, probably Trigger the youngest. That's me, Ralph said, without knowing or asking himself why. He was operating purely on instinct at this point. He went to Trigger, put an arm around his shoulder, and led him back in the direction of the laundry truck. Them guys okay? Fine, Ralph said. He glanced back and saw that Ed and Heavyset were standing by the truck bed with their heads together. Another cold spatter of rain fell, drumming on the blue tarpaulin like impatient fingers. A little fender bender, that's all. They're working it out. Beauty, Trigger Bacon said complacently. How that pretty wife of yours, Ralph? Ralph twitched, suddenly feeling like a man who remembers lunch, that he has forgotten to turn off the stove before leaving work. Jesus, he said, and looked at his watch. Hopping for 15:35 at least. And said he saw it was 10 minutes to 6, already 20 minutes past the time Carolyn expected him to bring her a bowl of soup and half a sandwich. She would be worried, in fact. With the lightning and the thunder booming through the empty apartment, she might be downright scared, and if it did rain, she would not be able to close the windows. She had almost no strength left in her hands. Ralph, Trigger asked, what's wrong? Nothing, he said. It's just that I got walking and lost all track of time, then this accident happened, and could you give me a ride home, Trig? I'll pay you. You don't need to pay nothing, Trigger said. It's on my way. Hop in, Ralph. You think those guys ain't gonna take after each other or nothing? No, Ralph said. I don't think so. Just 1 second. Sure. Ralph walked over to Ed. Are you okay with this? Are you getting it worked out? Yes, Ed replied. We're going to settle it privately. Why not? A little broken glass is all it really comes down to. He sounded completely like his old self now, and the man in the white shirt was looking at him with something that was almost respect. Ralph still felt perplexed and uneasy about what had happened here, but he decided he was going to let it go. He liked Ed DePayne a lot, but Ed was not his business. This July, Carolyn was. Carolyn and the thing which had started ticking in the walls of the bedroom and inside her late at night. Wait, he told Ed. I'm headed home. I make Carolyn her supper these days, and I'm running way late. He started to turn away. The heavy-set man stopped him with an outstretched hand. John Tandy, he said. He shook it. Ralph Roberts, pleased to meet you. Tandy smiled. Under the circumstances, I kind of doubt that, but I'm real glad you showed up when you did. For a few seconds there, I really thought him and me was gonna tango. So did I, Ralph thought, but didn't say. He looked at Ed, his troubled eye taking an unfamiliar t-shirt clinging to Ed's stock-thin midriff, and a white silk scarf with the Chinese red figurines embroidered on it. He didn't entirely look like the look in Ed's eyes when they met his. Ed was perhaps not all the way back after all. Sure you're okay? Ralph asked him. He wanted to go, wanted to get back to Carolyn, and yet he was somehow reluctant. The feeling that this situation was about 9 miles from right persisted. Yes, fine, Ed said quickly, and gave him a big smile, which did not reach his dark green eyes. They studied Ralph carefully, as if asking how much he had seen and how much, hey Susan Day, he would remember later on. Alright, so we're going to leave off there and go to our first music break. On this music break, we have the lovely and beautiful Miss Mia Savage with her group Antidote for Savages, and she's going to be singing Let Me Be Your Home, Your Skeleton, Our New Reality, and The Mirroring Crypto. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this music break.
that he brings anymore. You're mine. You're mine. Tonight. You're mine. You're mine. You're mine.
Welcome back, besties. Alright, so tonight we're doing story time with me, TessaTNT. And it's a pretty good book so far, I must say. I love Stephen King's writing. I wasn't expecting to read this book, but I didn't have time to go to the library, so I hope you guys don't mind a little Stephen King. He's a pretty good writer. I bet his wife is too. I gotta check out some of her stuff. Have you guys read her writing? Like, what does she write? Does she write horror like her husband, or is she more like a murder mystery, or I don't know. I gotta look and see what this chick is up to. But we'll do that later. We get back into our book, Insomnia. We left off where our buddy Ralph, I believe his name is, was getting a ride home. So the interior of Trigger Bacone's truck smelled of fresh pressed clothes, an aroma which for some reason always reminded Ralph of fresh bread. There was no passenger seat, so he stood with one hand wrapped around the door handle and the other gripping the edge of the Dundik's laundry basket. Man, look like some strange going back there, Trigger said, glancing into his outside mirror. Okay, so he's supposed to be Canadian, but it actually comes off to me as like Queen-ass or Louisiana. You don't know the half of it, Ralph said. I know the guy driving the rice burner, didn't you? His name is. He got a pretty little wife. Sends stuff out sometime. Seemed like a nice fella most usually. He sure wasn't himself today, Ralph said. Had a bug up his ass, did he? Had a whole damn ant farm up there, I think. Trigger laughed hard at that, pounding the worn black plastic of the big steering wheel. Whole damn ant farm, beauty. I'm saving that one, me. Trigger wiped his streaming eyes with a handkerchief almost the size of a tablecloth. Looked to me like Mr. Dibno come out that airport service gate, him. That's right, he did. You need a pass to use that way? Trigger said. How Mr. D get a pass, you tink? Ralph floated over, frowning, then shook his head. I don't know. It never occurred to me. I'll have to ask him next time I see him. You do that, Trigger said, and ask him how them ants doing. This stimulated a fresh throw of laughter, which in turn occasioned more flourishes of the comic opera handkerchief. As they turned off the extension and onto Paris Avenue proper, the storm finally broke. There was no hail, but the rain came in an extravagant summer flood, so heavy at first that Trigger had to slow down the panel truck to a crawl. Wow, he said respectfully. This reminded me of the big storm back in '85 when half of downtown fell in a damn canal. Remember that, Ralph? Yes, Ralph said. Let's hope it doesn't happen again. Yeah, Trigger said, grinning and peering past his extravagantly flapping windshield wipers. They got drainage system all fixed up now. Beauty. Combination of the cold rain and the warm cab caused the bottom half of the windshield to steam up. Without thinking, Ralph reached out a finger and drew a figure in the steam. What's that? Trigger asked. I don't really know. Looks Chinese, doesn't it? It was on the scarf Ed DePnew was wearing. Look a little familiar to me, Trigger said, glancing at it again. Then he snorted and flapped a hand. Listen to me, would ya? Only thing I can say in Chinese is Mu Gu Gai Pan. Ralph smiled, but didn't seem to have a laugh in him. It was Carolyn. Now that he had remembered her, he couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop imagining the windows open and the curtains streaming like Edward Gorey ghost arms as the rain poured in. I'm gonna run and do something really quick. I forgot something. Give me a second. I'll be right back. Yeah, I made something for Lily to eat and forgot to take it out of the microwave because I was tending to the fire. As it's getting late, it was actually a really nice day today, so we didn't do it till this evening, but it had burnt out. Alright, Ralph smiled, but didn't seem to have a laugh in him. It was Carolyn now. that he had remembered. He couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop imagining the windows open. "You still living in that two-story across from the Red Apple?" "Yes." Trigger pulled in to the curb, the wheels of the truck spraying up big fans of water. The rain was still pouring down in sheets. Lightning raced across the sky. Thunder cracked. "You better stay right here with me for a little bit," Trigger said. "She'll let up in a minute or two. I'll be all right, Ralph." Ralph didn't think anything could keep him in the truck a second longer. Not even handcuffs. "Thanks, Trig." "Wait a sec. Let me give you a piece of plastic. You can put it over your head, like a rain hat." "No, that's okay. No problem. Thanks. I'll just..." There seemed to be no way of finishing whatever it was he was trying to say, and now what he felt was close to panic. He shoved the truck's passenger door back on its track and jumped out, landing ankle-deep in the cold water racing down the gutter. He gave Trigger a final wave without looking back, then hurried up the walk to the house that he and Carolyn shared with Bill McGovern, filling in his pocket for his latchkey as he went. When he reached the porch steps, he saw he wouldn't need it. The door was standing ajar. Bill lived downstairs, often forgot to lock it, and Ralph would rather think it had been Bill than think that Carolyn had wandered out to look for him and been caught in the storm. That was a possibility Ralph did not even want to consider. He hurried into the shadowy foyer, wincing as thunder banged deafeningly overhead, and crossed to the foot of the stairs. He paused there a moment, hand on the newel post of the banister, listening to rainwater drip from his soaked pants and shirt onto the hardwood floor. Then he started up, wanting to run but no longer able to find the next gear up from a fast walk. His heart was beating hard and fast in his chest. His soaked sneakers were clammy anchors dragging at his feet, and for some reason he kept seeing the way Ed Dupney's head had moved when he got out of Dawson. Those stiff, quick jabs that made him look like a rooster, boiling for a fight. The bed riser creaked loudly, as it always did, and the sound provoked hurried footsteps from above. They were no relief because they weren't Carolyn's. He knew that at once, and when Bill McGovern leaned over the rail, his face pale and worried beneath his Panama hat, Ralph wasn't really surprised. All the way back from the extension, he had felt that something was wrong, hadn't he? Yes. But under the circumstances, that hardly qualified as precognition. When things reached a certain degree of wrongness, he was discovering they could no longer be redeemed or turned around. They just kept going wronger and wronger. He supposed that on some level or other, he'd always known that. What he had never suspected was how long that wrong road could be. "Ralph!" Bill called down. "Thank God, Carolyn's having, well, I guess it's some sort of seizure? I just dialed 911, asked them to send an ambulance." Ralph discovered he could run up the rest of the stairs after all. Chapter 4. She was lying half in and half out of the kitchen with her hair in her face. Ralph thought there was something particularly horrible about that. It looked sloppy, and if there was one thing Carolyn refused to be, it was sloppy. He knelt beside her and brushed the hair away from her eyes and forehead. The skin beneath his fingers felt as chilly as his feet inside his soaked sneakers. "I wanted to put her on a couch, but she's too heavy for me," Bill said nervously. He had taken off his Panama and was fiddling nervously with the band. "My back, you know." "I know, Bill, it's okay," Ralph said. He slid his arms under Carolyn and picked her up. She did not feel heavy to him at all, but light. Almost as light as a milkweed pod, which is ready to burst open and disgorge its filaments into the wind. "Thank God you were here." "I almost wasn't," Bill replied, following Ralph into the living room and still fiddling with his hat. He made Ralph think of old Lawrence Marsteller with his book of poems. "I wouldn't touch him anymore if I were you," old Dorrance had said. "I can't see your hands." "I was on my way out when I heard a hell of a thud." It must have been her falling. Bill looked around the storm-darkened living room, his face somehow distraught and avid at the same time, his eyes seeming to search for something that wasn't there. Then they brightened. "The door," he said. "I'll bet it's still open. It'll be raining in. I'll be right back, Ralph." He hurried out. Ralph barely noticed. The day had taken on the surreal aspects of a nightmare. The ticking was the worst. He could hear it in the walls, so loud now that even the thunder could not blot it out. He put Carolyn on the couch and knelt beside her. Her respiration was fast and shallow, and her breath was terrible. Ralph did not turn away from it, however. "Hang in there, sweetheart," he said. He picked up one of her hands that was almost as clammy as her brow had been, and kissed it gently. "You just hang in there. It's fine. Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. The ticking sound meant that nothing was fine. It wasn't in the walls either. It had never been in the walls, but only in his wife, and Carolyn. It was in his dear one. She was slipping away from him, and what would he ever do without her? "You just hang on," he said. "Hang on, you hear me?" He kissed her hand again and held it against his cheek, and when he heard the warble of the approaching ambulance, he began to cry. Chapter 5. She came around in the ambulance as it sped across Derry. The sun was already out again, the wet streets steaming, and at first she talked such gibberish that Ralph was sure she had suffered a stroke. Then, just as she began to clear up and speak coherently, a second convulsion struck, and it took both Ralph and one of the paramedics who had answered the call to hold her down. It wasn't Dr. Litchfield who came to see Ralph on the third floor, waiting room early that evening, but Dr. Jamal, the neurologist. Jamal talked to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him that Carolyn was now stabilized, that they were going to keep her overnight, just to be safe, but that she would be able to go home in the morning. There were going to be some new medications, drugs that were expensive, yes, but also quite wonderful. "We must not be losing the hope, Mr. Roberts," Dr. Jamal said. "No," Ralph said, "I suppose not." "Will there be more of these, Dr. Jamal?" Dr. Jamal smiled. He spoke in a quiet voice that was rendered somehow even more comforting by his soft Indian accent. And although Dr. Jamal did not come right out and tell him that Carolyn was going to die, he came as close as anyone ever did during the long year in which she battled to stay alive. The new medications, Jamal said, would probably prevent any further seizures, but things had reached a stage where all predictions had to be taken with a grain of salt. The tumor was spreading in spite of everything that they had tried, unfortunately. "The motor control problems may show up next," Dr. Jamal said in his comforting voice. "I am seeing some deterioration in the eyesight, I am afraid." "Can I spend the night with her?" Ralph asked quietly. "She'll sleep better if I do." He paused, then added, "So will I." "Of course," Dr. Jamal said, brightening. "That is fine, a fine idea." "Yes," Ralph said heavily. "I think so too." Chapter 6. So he sat beside his sleeping wife, and he listened to the ticking that was not in the walls, and he thought, someday soon, maybe this fall, maybe this winter, I will be back in this room with her. It had the feel not of speculation but of prophecy, and he leaned over and put his head on the white sheet that covered his wife's breast. He didn't want to cry again, but did a little anyway. That ticking was so loud and so steady. I'd like to get a hold of what's making that sound, he thought. I'd stamp it until it was so many pieces scattered across the floor. With God as my witness, I would. He fell asleep in his chair a little after midnight, and when he woke the next morning, the air was cooler than it had been in weeks, and Carolyn was wide awake, coherent, and bright-eyed. She seemed, in fact, hardly to be sick at all. Ralph took her home and began the not inconsiderable job of making her last months as comfortable as possible. It was a long while before he thought of Ed Depew again, even after he began to see the bruises on Helen Depew's face. It was a long time before he thought of Ed again. As the summer became fall and as the fall darkened down toward Carolyn's final winter, Ralph's thoughts were occupied more and more by the death watch, which seemed to tick louder and louder, even as it slowed down. But he had no trouble sleeping. That came later. Part 1. Little Bald Doctors. There is a gulf fixed between those who can sleep and those who cannot. It is one of the great divisions of the human race. It was by Iris Murdoch, Nuns and Soldiers. Chapter 1. About a month after the death of his wife, Ralph Roberts began to suffer from insomnia for the first time in his life. The problem was mild to begin with, but it grew steadily worse 6 months after the first interruptions in his heretofore unremarkable sleep cycle. Ralph had reached a state of misery he could hardly credit, let alone accept. Toward the end of the summer of 1993, he began to wonder what it would be like to spend his remaining years on Earth in the starry-eyed days of wakefulness. Of course it wouldn't come to that, he told himself. It never does. But was that true? He didn't really know. That was the double of it, and the books on the subject Mike Hanlon steered him to down at the Derry Public Library weren't much help. There were several on sleep disorders, but they seemed to contradict one another. Some called insomnia a symptom, others called it a disease, and at least one called it a myth. The problem went further than that, however. So Ralph could tell from the books no one seemed exactly sure what sleep itself was, how it worked, or what it did. He knew he should quit playing amateur researcher and go to the doctor, but he found that surprisingly hard to do. He supposed he still bore Dr. Litchfield's grudge. It was Litchfield, after all, who had originally diagnosed Carolyn's brain tumor as tension headaches. Except Ralph had an idea that Litchfield, a lifelong bachelor, might actually have believed that Carolyn was suffering from nothing but a moderate case of the vapors. And Litchfield, who had made himself as scarce as medically possible once Carolyn was diagnosed. Ralph was positive that if he had asked the man about that point blank, Litchfield would have said he had handed the case off to Jamal, the specialist. All quite proper and above board, yes, except Ralph had made it his business to get a good look into Litchfield's eyes on the few occasions he had seen him between Carolyn's first convulsions last July and her death this March. And Ralph thought that what he'd seen in those eyes was a mixture of unease and guilt. It was the look of a man trying very hard to forget he was fucked up. Ralph believed the only reason he could still look at Litchfield without wanting to knock his block off was that Dr. Jamal had told him that an earlier diagnosis probably would have made no difference by the time Carolyn's headache started. The tumor was already well entrenched, and no doubt sending out little bursts of bad cells to other areas of the brain, like malignant care packages. In late April, Dr. Jamal had left to establish a practice in southern Connecticut, and Ralph missed him. He thought that he could have talked about his sleeplessness to Dr. Jamal, and he had an idea that Jamal would have listened in a way Litchfield wouldn't, or couldn't. By late summer, Ralph had read enough about insomnia to know that the type with which he was afflicted, while not rare, was a lot less common than the usual slow sleep insomnia. People unaffected by insomnia are usually in first stage sleep 7 to 20 minutes after turning in. Slow sleepers, on the other hand, sometimes take as long as 3 hours to slip below the surface. And while normal sleepers begin to ramp down into third stage sleep, what some of the old books called theta sleep, Ralph had discovered 45 minutes or so after drifting off. Slow sleepers usually took an additional hour or two to get down there, and on many nights, they did not get all the way down at all. They awoke unrefreshed, sometimes with unfocused memories of unpleasant, tangled dreams, more often with the mistaken impression that they had been awake all night. Following Carolyn's death, Ralph began to suffer from premature waking. He continued to go to bed most nights following the conclusion of the 7 o'clock news, and he continued to pop off to sleep almost at once. And instead of waking promptly at 6:55, 5 minutes before the clock radio alarm buzzed, he began to wake at 6. And at first he dismissed this as no more than a price of living with a slightly enlarged prostate and a 70-year-old set of kidneys, but he never seemed to have to go that badly when he woke up, and he found it impossible to get back to sleep even after he'd emptied what had accumulated. He simply lay in the bed he'd shared with Carolyn for so many years, waiting for it to be 5 or 7, quarter till anyway, so he could get up. Eventually, he gave up even trying to drop off again. He simply lay there with his long-fingered, slightly swollen hands laced together on his chest, and stared up at the shadowy ceiling with eyes that felt as big as doorknobs. Sometimes he thought of Dr. Jamal, down there in Westport, talking in a soft, comforting Indian accent, building up his little piece of the American dream. Sometimes he thought of places he and Carolyn had gone in the old days, and the one he kept coming back to was a hot afternoon at Sand Beach in Bar Harbor. The two of them sitting at a picnic bench in their bathing suits, sitting under a big bright umbrella, eating sweet fried clams and drinking Bud from long neck bottles, as they watched the sailboats scudding across the dark blue ocean. When had that been? 1964? 1967? Did it matter? Probably not. The alterations in his sleep schedule wouldn't have mattered either. If they had ended there, Ralph would have adapted to the changes not just with ease, but with gratitude. All the books he hunted through that summer seemed to confirm one bit of folk wisdom he'd heard all his life. People slept less as they got older. If losing an hour or so a night was the only fee he had to pay for the dubious pleasure of being 70 years young, he would pay it gladly and consider himself well off. But it didn't end there. By the first week of May, Ralph was waking up to the birdsong at 5:15 a.m. He tried earplugs for a few nights, although he doubted from the outset that they would work. It wasn't the newly returned birds that were waking him up, nor occasional delivery traffic backfire out on Harris Avenue. He had always been the sort of guy who could sleep in the middle of a brass marching band, and he didn't think that had changed. What had changed was inside his head. There was a switch in there. Something was turning it on a little earlier every day, when Ralph hadn't the slightest idea of how to keep it from happening. By June, he was popping out of sleep like Jack out of his box at 4:30 a.m., 4:45 at the latest, and by the middle of July, not quite as hot as July of '92, but bad enough. Thanks very much. He was snapping to at around 4 o'clock. It was during those long hot nights, taking up too little of the bed, where he and Carolyn had made love on so many hot nights, and cold ones, that he began to consider what a hell his life would become if sleep departed entirely. In daylight, he was still able to scoff at the notion, but he was discovering certain dismal truths about F. Scott Fitzgerald's Dark Night of the Soul, and the grand prize winner was this: at 4:15 a.m., anything seems possible. Anything. During the days, he was able to go on telling himself that he was simply experiencing a readjustment of his sleep cycle, that his body was responding in perfectly normal fashion to a number of big changes in his life, retirement and the loss of his wife being the two biggest. He sometimes used the word loneliness when he thought about his new life, but he shied away with the dreaded D word, stuffing it back into the deep closet of his subconscious whenever it happened to glimmer for a moment in his thoughts. Loneliness was okay. Depression most certainly was not. Maybe you need to get more exercise, he thought. Do some walking like you used to last summer. After all, you've been leading a pretty sedentary life. Get up, eat toast, read a book, watch some TV, get a sandwich across the street and a red apple for lunch, potter around in the garden a little, maybe go to the library or visit with Helen and the baby if they happen to be out, eat supper, maybe sit on the porch and visit with McGovern or Louis Chase for a while. And then what? Read a little more? Watch a little more TV? Wash up? Go to bed? Sedentary. Boring. No wonder you wake up early. Except that was crap. His life sounded sedentary, yes, no doubt, but it really wasn't. The garden was a good example. What he did out there was never going to win him any prizes, but it was a hell of a long way from pottering around. Most afternoons he weeded until sweat made a dark tree shape down the back of his shirt and spread damp circles at his armpits, and he was often trembling with exhaustion by the time he let himself go back inside. Punishment, probably, would have been closer to the mark than pottering. But punishment for what? Waking up before dawn? Ralph didn't know and didn't care. Working in the garden filled up a large piece of the afternoon. It took his mind off things he didn't really care to think of, and that was enough to justify the aching muscles and the occasional flights of black spots in front of his eyes. He began his extended visits to the garden shortly after the 4th of July and continued all through August, long after the early crops had been harvested, and the later ones had been hopelessly stunted by the lack of rain. "You ought to quit that," Bill McGovern told him one night as they sat on the porch drinking lemonade. This was in mid-August, and Ralph had begun to work up around 3:30 each morning. "It's got to be hazardous to your health. Worse, you look like a lunatic." "Maybe I am a lunatic," Ralph responded shortly, and either his tone or the look in his eyes must have been convincing because McGovern changed the subject. Chapter 2. He did begin walking again. Nothing like the marathons of '92, but he managed 2 miles a day if it wasn't raining. His usual route took him down the perversely named Up Mile Hill to the Derry Public Library, and then on the back pages, a used bookstore and newsstand on the corner of Witcham and Main. Back pages stood next to the jumbled junkatorium called Secondhand Rose, Secondhand Clothes, and as he passed the store one day during the August of his discontent, Ralph saw a new poster among the announcements of outdated bean suppers and ancient church socials. So it covered roughly half of the yellowing Pat Buchanan for President placard. The woman in the 2 photographs at the top of the poster was a pretty blonde in her late 30s or early 40s, but the style of the photos, unsmiling full face on the left, unsmiling profile on the right, plain white background in both, was unsettling enough to stop Ralph in his tracks. The photos made the woman look as if she belonged in a post office wall or in a TV docudrama, and that the poster's printed matter made clear was no accident. The photos were what stopped him, but it was the woman's name that held him. Wanted for murder, Susan Edwina Day. It's printed across the top in big black letters, and below, the simulated mugshots in red, "Stay out of our city." There was a small line of print at the very bottom of the poster. Ralph's closed vision had deteriorated quite a bit since Carolyn's death. Gone to hell in a handbasket might actually have been a more accurate way of putting it, and he had to lean forward until his brow was pressed against the dirty show window of Secondhand Rose, Secondhand Clothes, before he could decipher it. Paid for by the Maine Life Watch Committee. Far down in his mind, a voice whispered, "Hey, hey, Susan Day. How many kids did you kill today?" Susan Day, Ralph recalled, was a political activist from either New York or Washington, the sort of fast-speaking woman who regularly drove taxi drivers, barbers, and hard-hat construction workers into foaming frenzies. Why that particular little jingle of doggerel had come into his mind, however, he couldn't say. It was tagged to some memory that wouldn't quite turn. Maybe his tired old brains were just cross-referencing that 60s Vietnam protest chant, the one which had gone, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did we kill today?" No, that's not it, he thought. Close but no cigar. It was, just before his mind could cough up Ed Dipnew's name and face, a voice spoke from almost beside him. "Earth to Ralph! Earth to Ralph! Come in, Ralphie baby!" Roused out of his thoughts, Ralph turned toward the voice. He was both shocked and amused to find he had almost been asleep on his feet. Christ, he thought, you never know how important sleep is until you miss a little. Then all the floors start to tilt and all the corners on things start to round off. It was Hamilton Davenport, the proprietor of Backpages, who had spoken to him. He was stocking the library cart he kept in front of his shop with brightly jacketed paperbacks. His old corncob pipe, to Ralph, had always looked like the stack of a model steamship, jutted from the corner of his mouth, sending little puffs of blue smoke into the hot, bright air. Winston Smith, his old gray tomcat, sat in the open window of the shop with his tail curled around his paws. He looked at Ralph with yellow-eyed indifference, as if to say, You think you know, old man, my friend. I'm here to testify you don't know dick about getting old. Sheesh, Ralph, Davenport said. I must have called your name at least 3 times. I guess I was wool gathering, Ralph said. He stepped past the little library cart and leaned in the doorway. Winston Smith held his place with regal disinterest and grabbed the 2 papers he bought every day, a Boston Globe and a USA Today. The Dairy News came right to the house, courtesy of Pete the paperboy. Ralph sometimes told people that he was sure one of the 3 papers was comic relief, but he had never been able to make up his mind which one it was. I haven't, he broke off as Ed News' face came into his mind. It was Ed he'd heard that nasty little chant from last summer out by the airport, and it really wasn't any wonder it had taken him a little while to retrieve the memory. Ed News was the last person in the world from whom you'd expect to hear something like that. Ralphie? Davenport said. You just shut down on me. Ralph blinked. Oh, sorry, I haven't been sleeping very well. That's what I started to say. Bummer. But there are worse problems. Just drink a glass of warm milk and listen to some quiet music half an hour before bed. Ralph had begun to discover this summer that everyone in America apparently had a pet remedy for insomnia. Some bit of bedtime magic that had been handed down through generations like the family Bible. Bach's good, also Beethoven, and William Ackerman ain't bad. But the real trick, Davenport raised one finger impressively to emphasize this, is not to get up from your chair during the half hour, not for anything. Don't answer the phone, don't wind up the dog and put out the alarm clock, don't decide to brush your teeth, nothing. Then when you do go to bed, bam, out like a light. What if you're sitting there in your favorite easy chair and all at once you realize you have a call of nature, Ralph asked. These things can come on pretty suddenly when you get to be my age. Do it in your pants, Davenport said promptly, and burst out laughing. Ralph smiled, but it had a due to fulfill. His insomnia was rapidly losing whatever marginal humor value it might once have had. In your pants, Ham chortled. He slapped the library cart and wagged his head back and forth. Ralph happened to glance down at the cat. Winston Smith looked blandly back at him, and to Ralph, his calm yellow gaze seemed to say, yes, that's right, he's a fool, but he's my fool. Not bad, huh? Hamilton Davenport, master of the snappy comeback. Do it in your... He snorted laughter, shook his head, then took the $2 bills Ralph was holding out. He slipped them into the pocket of his short red apron and came out with change. That about right? You bet. Thanks, Ham. Uh-huh. And all joking aside, try the music. It really works. Mellows out your brainwaves or something. I will. And the devil of it was, he probably would, as he had already tried Mrs. Rappaport's lemon and hot water recipe and Sean McClure's advice on how to clear his mind by slowing his respiration and concentration on the word cool, except for when Shauna said it, the word came out cool. When you were here trying to deal with the slow but relentless erosion of your good sleeping time, any folk remedy started to look good. Ralph began to turn away, then turned back. What's with that poster next door? Ham Davenport wrinkled his nose. Dan Dalton's place? I won't look in there at all, if I can help it. Screws up my appetite. Has he got something new and disgusting in the window? I guess it's new. It's not as yellow as the rest of them, and there's a notable lack of fly dirt on it. Looks like a wanted poster, only it's Susan Day in the photos. Susan Day on it, son of a bitch. He cast a dark and humorless look at the shop next door. What is she, president of the National Organization of Women or something? Ex-president and co-founder of Sisters in Arms, author of My Mother's Shadow and Lilies of the Valley. That one's a study of battered women, and why so many of them refuse to blow the whistle on the men that batter them. She won a Pulitzer Prize for it. Susie Day is one of the 3 or 4 most politically influential women in America right now, and she can really write as well as think. That clown knows I've got one of her petitions sitting right by my cash register. What petitions? We're trying to get her up here to speak, Davenport said. You know, the Right to Lifers tried to firebomb woman care last Christmas, right? Ralph cast his mind cautiously back into the black pit he'd been living in at the end of 92 and said, well, remember that the cops caught some guy in the hospital long-term parking lot with a can of gasoline, but I didn't know. That was Charlie Pickering. He's a member of Daily Bread, one of the Right to Life groups that keep the picket marching out there, Davenport said. They put him up to it, too. Take my word. This year, they're not bothering with gasoline, though. They're going to try to get the city council to change the zoning regulations and squeeze women care right out of existence. They just might do it, too. You know, Derry, Ralph, it's not exactly a hotbed of liberalism. No, Ralph said with a warm smile. It's never been that, and women care is an abortion clinic, isn't it? Davenport gave him an out-of-patience look and jerked his head in the direction of second-hand rose. That's what assholes like him call it, he said. Only, they like to use the word mill instead of clinic. They ignore all the other stuff women care does. Ralph Davenport had begun to sound like a little TV announcer who hawked run-free pantyhose during the Sunday afternoon movie. They're involved in family counseling, they deal with spouse and child abuse, and they run a shelter for abused women over by the Newport Town line. They have a rape crisis center at the in-town building by the hospital, and a 24-hour hotline for women who have been raped or beaten. In short, they stand for all things that make Marlboro men like Dalton shit bullets. But they do perform abortions, Ralph said. That's what the pickets are about, right? There had been a sign carrying demonstrators in front of the low-slung, unobtrusive brick building that housed women care for years, it seemed to Ralph. They always looked too pale to him, too intense, too skinny or too fat, too utterly sure that God was on their side. The signs they carried said things like, the unborn have rights too, and life, what a beautiful choice, and that old standby, abortion is murder. On several occasions, women using the clinic, which was near Derry home, but not actually associated with it, Ralph thought, had been spat upon. Yeah, they perform abortions, Ham said. You got a problem with that? Ralph thought of all the years he and Carolyn had tried to have a baby. Years that had produced nothing but several false alarms and a single messy 5 months miscarriage. And shrugged. Suddenly the day seemed too hot and his legs too tired. The thought of his return journey, the up-mile hill leg of it in particular, hung in the back of his mind like something strung from a line of fishhooks. Christ, I don't know, he said. I just wish people didn't have to get so shrill. Davenport grunted, walked over to his neighbor's display window, and peered at the bogus wanted poster. While he was looking at it, a tall, pallid man with a goatee, the absolute antithesis of the Marlboro Man, Ralph would have said, materialized from the gloomy depths of the second-hand rose like a vaudeville spook that has gotten a bit moldy around the edges. He saw that Davenport was looking at, and a tiny, disdainful smile dimpled the corners of his mouth. Ralph thought it was the kind of smile that could cost a man a couple of teeth or a broken nose, especially on a dog-hot day like this one. Davenport pointed at the poster and shook his head violently. Dalton's smile deepened. He flapped his hands at Davenport. Who gives a shit what you think, the gesture said, and then disappeared back into the depths of the store. Davenport returned to Ralph, bright spots of color burning in his cheek. That man's picture should be next to the word prick in the dictionary, he said. Exactly what he thinks about you, I imagine, Ralph thought, but of course did not say. Davenport stood in front of the library cart full of paperbacks, hands stuffed into his pockets beneath his red change apron, rooting at the poster of Hey, Hey, Susan Day. Well, Ralph said, I suppose I better. Davenport shook himself out of his brown study. Don't go yet, he said. Sign my petition first, will you? Put a little shine back on my morning. Ralph shifted his feet uncomfortably. I usually don't get involved in confrontational stuff like, come on, Ralph, Davenport said in a let's be reasonable voice. We're not talking confrontation here. We're talking about making sure that the fruits and nuts like the ones who run Daily Bread and political Neanderthals like Dalton don't shut down a really useful women's resource center. It's not like I'm asking you to endorse testing chemical warfare weapons on dolphins. No, Ralph said. I suppose not. We're hoping to send 5,000 signatures to Susan Day by the 1st of September. Probably won't do any good. Derry's really not much more than a wide place in the road, but she's probably booked into the next century anyhow, but it can't hurt to try. Ralph thought about telling him that the only petition he wanted to sign was one asking the gods of sleep to give him back the 3 hours or so of good rest a night they had stolen away. But then he took another look at the man's face and decided against it. Carolyn would have signed his damn petition, he thought. She was no fan of abortion, but she was also no fan of men coming home after the bars closed and mistaking their wives and kids for soccer balls. True enough, but that wouldn't have been her main reason for signing. She would have done it on the off chance that she might get to hear an authentic firebrand like Susan Day up close and in person. She would have done it out of the ingrained curiosity, which had perhaps been her dominating characteristic, something so strong not even the brain tumor had been able to kill it. 2 days before she died, she had pulled the movie ticket he'd been using as a bookmark out of the paperback novel he'd left on her bedside table because she wanted to know what he'd been to see. It had been A Few Good Men, as a matter of fact, and he was both surprised and dismayed to discover how much it hurt to remember that. Even now, it hurt like hell. Sure, he told him, I'll be happy to sign it. My man, Davenport exclaimed and clapped him on the shoulder. The broody look was replaced by a grin, but Ralph didn't think the change much of an improvement. The grin was hard and not especially charming. Step into my den of iniquity. Ralph followed him into the tobacco-smelling shop, which did not seem particularly iniquitous at 9:30 in the morning. Winston Smith fled before them, pausing just once to look back at his ancient yellow eyes. He's a fool, and you're another, that parting state might have said. Under the circumstances, it wasn't a conclusion. Ralph felt much inclined to dispute. He tucked his newspaper under his arm, leaned over the rolled sheet on the counter beside the cash register, and signed the petition asking Susan Day to come to Derry and speak in defense of women care. Alright, boys and girls, we're going to go to our second music break. On this music break, we once again have Miss Lee Savage with her group Antidote for Savages, and she's going to be singing Not a Phase, Singing to Your Grave, Bury Me in Heaven. And the bottom line, you guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this music break.
Break us out of this. What I got so wrong? Got a part of you with me too. What I brought to life, just a hollow victory. Lost my head tonight, things start to look and sleep. So I'm waiting to let this go last Sunday, yeah. So I'll be talking to your girl, I'll be saying to your girl someday.
Just a choice right now between fear and love. Choice right now between fear and love.
Welcome back, and thanks so much for joining me tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. Tonight we're doing story time with me, TessaTNT, and the book is Stephen King's Insomnia. Chapter 3. He did better climbing up Mile Hill than he had expected and crossed the X-shaped intersection of Witcham and Jackson, thinking, there, that wasn't so bad, was... He suddenly realized that his ears were ringing and his legs had begun to tremble beneath him. He stopped on the far side of Witcham and placed one hand against his shirt. He could feel his heart beating just beneath it, pumping away with a ragged fierceness that was scary. He heard a papery rustle and saw an advertising supplement slip out of the Boston Globe and go seesawing down into the gutter. He started to bend over and get it, then stopped. Not a good idea, Ralph. If you bend over, you're more than likely going to fall over. I suggest you leave that one for the sweeper. Yeah, okay, good idea, he muttered and straightened back up. Black dots surged across his vision like a surreal flock of crows, and for a moment Ralph was almost positive he was going to wind up lying on top of the ad supplement, no matter what he did or didn't do. Ralph, you alright? He looked up cautiously and saw Lois Chase, who lived on the other side of Harris Avenue and half a block down from the house he shared with Bill McGovern. She was sitting on one of the benches just outside Stafford Park, probably waiting for the Canal Street bus to come along and take her downtown. Sure, fine, he said, and made his legs move. He felt as if he were walking through syrup, but he thought he got over the bench without looking too bad. He could not, however, suppress a grateful little gasp as he sat down next to her. Lois Chase had large dark eyes, the kind that had been called Spanish eyes when Ralph was a kid. And he bet they had danced through the minds of dozens of boys during Lois's high school years. They were still her best feature, but Ralph didn't much care for the worry he saw in them now. It was, what? A little too neighborly for comfort, was the first thought to occur to him, but he wasn't sure it was the right thought. Fine, Lois echoed. You betcha. He took his handkerchief from his back pocket, checked to make sure it was clean, and then wiped his brow with it. I hope you don't mind me saying it, Ralph, but you don't look fine. Ralph did mind her saying it, but didn't know how to say so. You're pale, you're sweating, and you're a litter bug. Ralph looked at her startled. Something fell out of your paper? I think it was an ad circular. Did it? You know perfectly well it did. Excuse me a second. She got up, crossed the sidewalk, bent. Ralph noticed that while her hips were fairly broad, her legs were still admirably trim for a woman who had to be 68. And picked up the circular, came back to the bench with it, and sat down. There, she said. Now you're not a litter bug anymore. He smiled in spite of himself. Thank you. Don't mention it. I can use the Maxwell House coupon, also the Hamburger Helper and the Diet Coke. I've gotten so fat since Mr. Chase died. You're not fat, Lois. Thank you, Ralph. You're a perfect gentleman. But let's not change the subject. You had a dizzy spell, didn't you? In fact, you almost passed out. I was just catching my breath, he said stiffly, and turned to watch a bunch of kids playing scrub baseball just inside the park. They were going at it hard, laughing and grab-assing around. Ralph envied the efficiency of their air conditioning systems. Catching your breath, were you? Yes. Just catching your breath? Lois, you're starting to sound like a broken record. Well, the broken record's going to tell you something, okay? You're nuts to be trying up Mile Hill in this heat. If you want to walk, why not go out to the extension where it's flat, like you used to? Because it makes me think of Carolyn, he said, not liking the stiff, almost rude way that sounded, but unable to help it. Oh shit, she said, and touched his hand briefly. Sorry. It's okay. No, it's not. I should have known better, but the way you look just now, that's not okay either. You're not 20 anymore, Ralph. Not even 40. I don't mean like you're not in good shape. Anyone can see you're in great shape for a guy your age, but you ought to take better care of yourself. Carolyn would want you to take care of yourself. I know, he said, but I'm really... All right, he meant to finish, and then he looked up from his hands, looked into her dark eyes again, and what he saw there made it impossible to finish for a moment. There was a weary sadness in her eyes, or was it loneliness? Maybe both. In any case, those were not the only things he saw in them. He also saw himself. You're being silly, the eyes looking into his said. Maybe we both are. You're 70 and a widower, Ralph. I'm 68 and a widow. How long are we going to sit on your porch in the evenings with Bill McGovern as the world's oldest chaperone? Not too long, I hope, because neither of us is exactly fresh off the showroom lot. Ralph, Lois asked, suddenly concerned, are you okay? Yes, he said, looking down at his hands again. Yes, sure. You had a look on your face like, well, I don't know. Ralph wondered if maybe the combination of the heat and the walk up Mile Hill had scrambled his brains a little, because this was Lois after all, whom McGovern always referred to with a small, satiric lift of his eyebrow as our Lois. And okay, yes, she was still in good shape, trim legs, nice bust, and those remarkable eyes, and maybe he wouldn't mind taking her to bed, and maybe she wouldn't mind being taken. But that would be, somewhere after that. If she happened to see a ticket stub poking out of the book he was reading, would she pull it out? Too curious about what the movie he'd been to see to think about how she was losing his place? Ralph thought not. Those eyes were remarkable, and he had found his own eyes wandering down the V of her blouse more than once, as the three of them sat on the front porch, drinking iced tea in the cool of the evening. But he had an idea that your little head could get big, turned to a big head in trouble even at 70. Getting old was no excuse to get careless. He got to his feet, aware of Lois looking at him and making an extra effort not to stoop. "Thanks for your concern," he said. "Want to walk an old feller up the street?" "Thanks, but I'm going downtown. They've got some beautiful rose-colored yarn in at the sewing circle, and I'm thinking Afghan. Meanwhile, I'll just wait for the bus and gloat over my coupons." Ralph grinned. "You do that." He glanced over at the kids on the scrub ball field. As he watched, a boy with an extravagant mop of red hair broke from third, threw himself down in a head-first slide, and fetched up against one of the catcher's shin guards with an audible thunk. Ralph winced, envisioning ambulances with flashing lights and screaming sirens. But the Carrot Top bounced to his feet, laughing. "Missed the tag, you hoser," he shouted. "The hell I did," the catcher responded indignantly, but then he laughed too. "Ever wish you were that age again, Ralph?" Willis asked. He thought it over. "Sometimes," he said. "Mostly it just looks too strenuous. Come on over tonight, Lois. Sit with us a while." "I might just do that," she said, and Ralph started up Harris Avenue, feeling the weight of her remarkable eyes on him and trying hard to keep his back straight. He thought he managed fairly well, but it was hard work. He had never felt so tired in his life. Ralph made the appointment to see Dr. Litchfield less than an hour after his conversation with Lois on the park bench. The receptionist with the cool, sexy voice told him she could fit him in next Tuesday morning at 10 if that was okay, and Ralph told her that that was fine as paint. Then he hung up, went into the living room, sat in the wing chair that overlooked Harris Avenue, and thought about how Dr. Litchfield had initially treated his wife's brain tumor with Tylenol 3 and pamphlets explaining various relaxation techniques. From there he moved on to the look he'd seen in Litchfield's eyes after the magnetic resonance imaging test had confirmed the CAT scan's bad news, that look of guilt and unease. Across the street, a bunch of kids, who would soon be back in school, came out of the Red Apple armed with candy bars and Slurpees. As Ralph watched them mount their bikes and tear away into the bright 11 o'clock heat, he thought what he always did when the memory of Dr. Litchfield's eyes surfaced, that it was most likely a false memory. "The thing is, old buddy, you wanted Litchfield to look uneasy, but even more than that, you wanted him to look guilty." Quite possibly true, quite possibly Carl Litchfield was a peach of a guy and a hell of a doctor, but Ralph still found himself calling Litchfield's office again half an hour later. He told the receptionist with the sexy voice that he just rechecked his calendar and discovered next Tuesday at 10 wasn't so fine after all. He'd made an appointment with a podiatrist for that day and forgotten all about it. "My memory's not what it used to be," Ralph told her. The receptionist suggested next Thursday at 2. Ralph countered by promising to call back. "Liar, liar, pants on fire," he thought as he hung up the phone, walked slowly back to the wing chair and lowered himself into it. "You're done with him, aren't you?" I suppose he was. Not that Dr. Litchfield was apt to lose any sleep over it. If he thought about Ralph at all, it would be as one less old geezer to fart in his face during the prostate exam. "Alright, so what are you going to do about the insomnia, Ralph?" "Sit quiet for half an hour before bedtime and listen to classical music," he said out loud. "Write some depends for those troublesome calls of nature." Yet he supposed he would try Hamilton Davenport's suggestion, although he would skip the diapers, thank you. As he tried most of the folk remedies well-meaning people had passed on to him, this made him think of his first bona fide folk remedy, and that raised another grin. It had been McGovern's idea. He had been sitting on the porch one evening when Ralph came back from the Red Apple with some noodles and spaghetti sauce, had taken one look at his upstairs neighbor and made the tsk-tsk sound, shaking his head dolefully. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ralph asked, taking the seat next to him. A little farther down the street, a little girl in jeans and an oversized white t-shirt had been skipping rope and chanting in the growing gloom. It means you're looking folded, spindled, and mutilated, McGovern said. He used one thumb to tilt the Panama back on his head and look more closely at Ralph. Still not sleeping? Still not sleeping, Ralph agreed. McGovern was quiet for a few seconds. When he spoke again, he did so in a tone of absolute, almost apocalyptic, in fact, finality. Whiskey is the answer, he said. I beg your pardon? To your insomnia, Ralph. I don't mean you should take a bath in it. There's no need of that. Just mix a tablespoon of honey with half a shot of whiskey and hook it down 15 or 20 minutes before you hit the hay. You think? Ralph had asked hopefully. All I can say is it worked for me, and I had some real problems sleeping around the time I turned 40. Looking back on it, I guess that was my midlife crisis. 6 months of insomnia and a year-long depression over my bald spot. Although the books he'd been consulting all said that booze was a vastly overrated cure for sleeplessness, it often made the problem worse instead of better, in fact. Ralph had tried it just the same. He had never been much of a drinker, so he began adjusting McGovern's recommended half-shot dosage down to a quarter of a shot. But after a week of relief, he had upped the ante to a full shot, then to 2. He woke up one morning at 4:22 with a nasty little headache to accompany the dull brown taste of early times on the roof of his mouth, and realized he was suffering his first hangover in 15 years. Life's too short for this shit, he had announced to his empty apartment, and that had been the end of the great whiskey experiment. Okay, Ralph thought, now as he watched the desultory mid-morning flow of customers in and out of the Red Apple across the street. Here's the situation. McGovern says you look like shit. You almost fainted at Louis Chase's feet this morning, and you just canceled the appointment you made with the old family physician. So what next? Just let it go? Accept the situation? And let it go? The idea had a certain oriental charm. Fate, karma, and all that, but he was going to need more than charm to get him through the long hours of early morning. The book said that there were people in the world, quite a lot of them, who managed very well on no more than 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night. There were even some who got along on only 2. They were an extremely small minority, but they did exist. Ralph Roberts, however, was not among their number. How he looked wasn't very important to him. He had a feeling that his matinee idol days were well behind him, but how he felt was, and it was no longer just a matter of not feeling good, he felt horrible. The insomnia had begun to pervade every aspect of his life. The way the smell of frying garlic on the 5th floor will eventually pervade an entire apartment building. The color had started to drain out of things. The world had begun to take on the dull, grainy quality of a newspaper photograph. Simple decisions, whether to heat up a frozen dinner for his evening meal, or grab a sandwich at the Red Apple, or go up to the picnic area by Runway 3, for example, had become difficult, almost agonizing. In the last couple weeks, he had found himself coming back to the apartment from Dave's video stop, empty-handed more and more often. Not because there was nothing at Dave's he wanted to watch, but because there was too much. He couldn't decide if he wanted one of the Dirty Harry movies, or a Billy Crystal comedy, or maybe a few old Star Trek episodes. After a couple of these unsuccessful trips, he had plopped himself down in his very wing chair, almost crying with frustration, and he supposed fear. That creeping sensory numbness and the erosion of his decision-making capabilities were not the only problems he had come to associate with the insomnia. His short-term memory had also begun to slip. It had been his practice to go to the movies at least once and sometimes twice a week ever since his retirement from the print shop, where he had finished his working life as a bookkeeper and general supervisor. He had taken Carolyn until last year when she had gotten too sick to enjoy going out anywhere. After her death, he had mostly gone alone, although Helen Deepnew had accompanied him once or twice when Ed was home to mind the baby. Ed himself almost never went, claiming he got headaches at the movies. Ralph had gotten so used to calling the cinema center's answering machine to check showtimes that he had the number by heart. As the summer went on, however, he found himself having to look it up in the yellow pages more and more often. He could no longer be sure if the last 4 digits were 1317 or 1713. It's 1713, he said now. I know it is. But did he know it? Did he really? Call Litchfield back. Go on, Ralph. Stop sifting through the wreckage. Do something constructive. And if Litchfield really sticks in your craw, call somebody else. The phone book's as full of doctors as it ever was. Probably true, but 70 was maybe a little old to be picking a new sawbones by the eeny-meeny-miny-mo method, and he wasn't going to call Litchfield back, period. Okay, so what's next, you stubborn old goat? A few more folk remedies? I hope not, because at the rate you're going, you'll be down to eye up the newt and tongue of toad in no time. The answer that came was like a cool breeze on a hot day, and it was an absurdly simple answer. All his book research this summer had been aimed at understanding the problem rather than finding the solution. When it came to answers, he had relied almost solely on backfence remedies like whiskey and honey, even when the books had already assured him they probably wouldn't work or would only work for a while. Although the books did offer some presumably reliable methods for coping with insomnia, the only one Ralph had actually tried was the simplest and most obvious: going to bed earlier in the evening. And that solution hadn't worked. He had simply lain awake until 11:30 or so, then dropped off to awaken at his new earlier time, but something else might. It was worth a try anyway. Instead of spending the afternoon in his usual frenzy of backyard pottering, Ralph went down to the library and skimmed through some of the books he had already looked at. The general consensus seemed to be that if going to bed earlier didn't work, going later might. Ralph went home, mindful of his previous adventures. He took the bus, filled with cautious hope. It might work. If it didn't, he always had Bach, Beethoven, or William Ackerman to fall back on. His first attempt at this technique, which one of the texts called delayed sleep, was comic. He awoke at his now usual time, 3:45, by the digital clock on the living room mantel, with a sore back and aching neck, no immediate idea of how he had gotten into the wing chair by the window, or why the TV was on, broadcasting nothing but snow and a soft, surf-like roar of static. It was only as he allowed his head to roll cautiously back, supporting the nape of his neck with a cupped palm, that he realized what had happened. He had intended to sit up until at least 3 o'clock and possibly 4, would then stroll off to bed and sleep the sleep of the just. That had been the plan anyway. Instead, the incredible insomniac of Harris Avenue had dropped off during Jay Leno's opening monologue, like a kid who's trying to stay up all night long just to see what it's like. And then, of course, he had finished the adventure by waking up in the damn chair. The problem was the same. Joe Friday might have said, only the location had changed. Ralph strolled off to bed anyway, hoping against hope, but the urge, if not the need, to sleep had passed. After an hour of lying awake, he had gone back to the wing chair again, this time with a pillow propped behind his stiff neck and a rueful grin on his face. There was nothing funny about his second try, which took place the following night. Sleepiness began to steal over him at its usual time, 11:20, just as Pete Cherney was giving the following day's weather forecast. This time, Ralph fought it successfully, making it all the way through Whoopi. Although he almost nodded off during Whoopi's conversation with Roseanne Arnold, that evening's guest. In the late-night movie that came on after that, it was an old Audie Murphy flick in which Audie appeared to be winning the war in the Pacific pretty much single-handed. It sometimes seemed that to Ralph that there was an unspoken rule among local TV broadcasts which stated that movies telecast in small hours of the morning could star only Audie Murphy or James Brolin. After the last Japanese pillbox had been blown up, Channel 2 signed off. Ralph dialed around looking for another movie and found nothing but snow. He supposed he could have watched the movies all night if he had the cable. Like Bill downstairs or Lois on the street, he remembered having put that on his list of things to do in the new year. But then Carolyn had dialed the cable TV, with or without home box office, had no longer seemed very important. He found a copy of Sports Illustrated and began to slog through an article on women's tennis he had missed the first time through, glancing up at the clock every now and then as the hands began to close on 3 a.m. He had become all but convinced that this was going to work. His eyelids were so heavy they felt as if they had been dipped in concrete, and although he was reading the tennis article carefully, word for word, he had no idea of what the writer was driving at. Whole sentences zipped across his brain without sticking like cosmic rays. I'm going to sleep tonight. I really think I am. For the first time in months, the sun is going to have to come up without my help, and that isn't just good, friends and neighbors. That is great. Then shortly after 3 o'clock, the pleasant drowsiness began to disappear. It did not go with a champagne cork pop, but rather seemed to ooze away, like sand through a fine sieve of water down a partially clogged drain. Then Ralph realized what was happening. It wasn't panic he felt, but sick dismay. It was a feeling he had come to recognize as the true opposite of hope. And when he slipper-scuffed his way into the bedroom at 3:15, he couldn't remember a depression as deep as the one which now enveloped him. He felt as if he were suffocating in it. Please God, just 40 winks, he muttered as he turned off the light, but he strongly suspected that this was one prayer which was not going to be answered. It wasn't. Although he had been awake for 24 hours by then, every trace of sleepiness had left his mind and body by 4:15. He was tired, yes, more deeply and fundamentally tired than he had ever been in his life, but being tired and being sleepy, he had discovered, were sometimes poles apart. Sleep, that undiscriminating friend, humankind's best and most reliable nurse since the dawn of time, had abandoned him again. By 4 o'clock, Ralph's bed had become hateful to him, as it always did when he realized he could put it to no good use. He swung his feet back onto the floor, scratching the mat of hair, almost entirely gray now, which curled through his most unbuttoned pajama top. He slid in his slippers again and scuffed back to the living room, where he dropped into the wing-back chair and looked down at Harris Avenue. It was laid out like a stage set where the only actor currently on view wasn't even human. It was a stray dog moving slowly down Harris Avenue in the direction of Strawford Park and up Mile Hill. He held his right rear leg up as much as possible, limping along as best it could on the other 3. Hi there, Rosalie, Ralph muttered and rubbed a hand across his eyes. It was a Thursday morning garbage pickup day on Harris Avenue, so he wasn't surprised to see Rosalie, who'd been a wandering here and there fixture in the neighborhood for the last year or so. She made her way down the street leisurely, investigating the rows and clusters of cans with the discrimination of a jaded flea market shopper. Now Rosalie, who was limping worse than ever this morning, and looked as tired as Ralph felt, found what looked like a good-sized beef bone and trotted away with it in her mouth. Ralph watched her out of sight, then simply sat with his hands folded in his lap, gazing out on the silent neighborhood, where the orange high-intensity lamps added to the illusion that Harris Avenue was nothing but a stage set standing deserted after the evening performance had ended and the actors had gone home. They shone down like spotlights in a perfect diminishing perspective, and was surreal and hallucinatory. Ralph Roberts sat in the wing chair where he had spent so many early morning hours lately and waited for light and movement to invest the lifeless world below him. Finally, the first human actor, Pete, the paper boy, entered stage right, riding his Raleigh. He biked his way up the street, tossing rolled newspapers from the bag that slung over his shoulder and hitting the porches he aimed at with a fair degree of accuracy. Ralph watched him a while, then heaved a sigh, which felt as if it had come all the way from the basement, and got up to make tea. "I don't remember ever reading about this shit in my horoscope," he said hollowly, and then turned on the kitchen tap and began to fill the kettle. That long Thursday morning and even longer Thursday afternoon taught Ralph Roberts a valuable lesson. Not to snare at 3 or 4 hours sleep a night simply because he had spent his entire life under the mistaken impression that he had a right to at least 6 and usually 7. It also served as a hideous preview. If things didn't improve, he could look forward to feeling like this most of the time. Hell, all of the time. He went into the bedroom at 10 o'clock and began at 1, hoping for a little nap. Even a cat nap would do, and half an hour would be a lifesaver, but he could not so much as drowse. He was miserably tired, but not in the least bit sleepy. Around 3 o'clock, he decided to make himself a Lipton cup of soup. He filled the kettle with fresh water, put it on to boil, and opened the cupboard. Over the counter, where he kept condiments, spices, and various envelopes containing foods which only astronauts and old men actually seem to eat, powders to which the consumer need only add water. He pushed cans and bottles around in aimless fashion and then simply stared into the cupboard for a while, as if expecting the box of soup packets to magically appear in the space he had made. When they didn't, he repeated the process, only this time moving things back to their original positions before starting in again with the look of distant perplexity which was becoming. Ralph, mercifully, did not know this, his dominant expression. When the tea kettle shrieked, he put it on one of the rear burners and went back to staring into the cupboard. It dawned on him, very, very slowly, that he must have drunk his last packet of cup of soup yesterday, or the day before, although he could not for the life of him remember doing so. Well, that's a surprise. He asked the boxes and bottles in the open cupboard. "I'm so tired, I can't remember my own name." "Yes, I can," he thought. "It's Leon Redbone, so there." It wasn't much of a joke, but he felt a small smile. It felt as light as a feather. Touch his lips. He stepped into the bathroom, combed his hair, and then went downstairs. "Here's Audie Murphy, heading out into the enemy territory in search of supplies," he thought. Primary target, 1 box of Lipton chicken and rice cup of soup packets. If locating and securing this target should prove impossible, I'll divert to my secondary, noodles and beef. "Oh, this is a risky mission, but I work best alone," he finished as he came out on the porch. Old Mrs. Perrine happened to be passing, and she favored Ralph with a sharp look but said nothing. He waited for her to get a little way up the sidewalk. He did not feel capable of conversation with anyone this afternoon, least of all Mrs. Perrine, who, at 82, could still have found stimulating and useful work among the Marines at Paris Island. He pretended to be examining the spider plant which hung from a hook under the porch eave until she had reached what seemed to be a safe distance, then crossed Harris Avenue to the Red Apple, which was where the day's real troubles began. He entered the convenience store, once again, mulling over the spectacular failure of the delayed sleep experiment and wondering if the advice in the library text was no more than an uptown version of the folk remedies his acquaintances seemed so eager to press upon him. It was an unpleasant idea, but he thought his mind, or force below his mind, which is actually in charge of his slow torture, had sent him a message which was even more unpleasant. "You have a sleep window, Ralph. It's not as big as it once was, and it seems to be getting smaller with every passing week, but you better be grateful for what you've got, because a small window is better than no window at all. You see that now, don't you?" "Yes," Ralph mumbled as he walked down the center aisle to the bright red cup of soup boxes. "I see that very well." Sue, the afternoon counter girl, laughed cheerfully. "You must have money in the bank, Ralph," she said. "Beg your pardon?" Ralph didn't turn. He was inventorying the red boxes. Here was onion, split pea, the beef and noodles combo, but where the hell was the chicken and rice? "No," I said. "People who talk to themselves have..." Oh my god. For a moment, Ralph thought she'd simply made a statement, a little too complex for his tired mind to immediately grasp. Something about how people who talked to themselves had found God, and then she screamed. He had hunkered down to check the boxes on the bottom shelf, and the scream shot him to his feet so hard and fast that his knees popped. He went toward the front of the store, bumping the top shelf of the soup display with his elbow and knocking half a dozen red boxes into the aisle. "Sue, what's wrong?" Sue paid no attention. She was looking out through the door with her fisted hands pressed against her lips and her brown eyes huge above them. "God, look at the blood!" she cried in a choked voice. Ralph turned, farther, knocking a few more Lipton boxes into the aisle, and looked through the red apple's dirty show window. What he saw drew a gasp from him, and it took him a space of seconds, 5 maybe, to realize that the bloody, beaten woman staggering toward the red apple was Helen DePnew. Ralph had always thought Helen the prettiest woman on the west side of town, but there was nothing pretty about her today. One of her eyes was puffed shut. There was a gash at her left temple that was soon going to be lost in the gaudy swelling of a fresh bruise. Her puffy lips and her cheeks were covered with blood. The blood had come from her nose, which was still leaking. She rolled through the red apples in a parking lot toward the door like a drunk. Her one good eye seeming to see nothing, it simply stared. More frightening than the way she looked was the way she was handling Natalie. She had the squalling, frightened baby slung casually on one hip, carrying her as she might have carried her books to high school 10 or 12 years ago. "Oh, Jesus, she's gonna drop the kid," Sue screamed, but although she was 10 steps closer to the door than he was, she made no move. Simply stood where she was with her hands pressed to her mouth and her eyes gobbling up her face. Ralph didn't feel tired anymore. He sprinted up the aisle, tore open the door, and ran outside. He was just in time to catch Helen by the shoulders as she banged a hip against the ice cabinet. Mercifully, not the hip with Natalie on it, and went veering off in a new direction. "Helen!" he yelled. "Jesus, Helen, what happened?" "Hun?" she asked, her voice dully curious, totally unlike the voice of a living young woman who sometimes accompanied him to the movies and moaned over Mel Gibson. Her good eye rolled toward him, and he saw that the dull curiosity in it, a look that said she didn't know who she was, let alone where she was, or what had happened or when. "Hun, Ralph, what?" The baby slept. Ralph let go of Helen and grabbed for Natalie and managed to snag one of her jumper straps. Nat screamed, waved her hands, and stared at him with huge dark blue eyes. He got his hand between Nat's legs, an instant before the strap that was holding her tore free. For a moment, the howling baby balanced on his hand like a gymnast on a balance beam, and Ralph could feel the damp bulge of her diapers through the overalls she was wearing.
You doing good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you?
Good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm reading on my show.
Bye.
Bye. Love you.
Too.
Then he slipped his hand around her back and hoisted her up against his chest. His heart was pounding hard, and even with the baby safe in his arms, he kept seeing her slip away, kept seeing her head with its cap of fine hair slamming against the butt-littered pavement with a sickening crack. Ralph, Helen asked. So Natalie in Ralph's arms, and some of the dullness went out of her good eye. She raised her hands toward the child, and in Ralph's arms, Natalie mimicked the gesture with her own chubby hands. Then Helen staggered, struck the side of the building, and reeled backward a step. One foot tangled in the other. Ralph saw splatters of blood on her small white sneakers, and it was amazing how bright everything was all of a sudden. The color had come back into the world, at least temporarily. And she would have fallen if Sue hadn't picked that moment to finally venture out. Instead of going down, Helen landed against the open door and just leaned there, like a drunk against a lamppost. Ralph. The expression in her eyes was a little sharper now, and Ralph saw it wasn't so much curiosity as incredulity. She drew in a deep breath and made an effort to force intelligible words past her swelled lips. Give me my baby. Baby, give me. Molly. Not just yet, Helen, Ralph said. You're not too steady on your feet right now. Sue was still on the other side of the door, holding it so Helen wouldn't fall. The girl's cheeks and forehead were ashy pale, her eyes filled with tears. Get out here, Ralph told her. Hold her up. I can't, she blubbered. She's all bloody. Oh, for God's sake, quit it. It's Helen. Helen Depew from the street. She's right up there. And although Sue must have known that actually hearing the name seemed to turn the trick, she slipped around the open door, and when Helen staggered backward again, Sue curled an arm around her shoulders and braced her firmly. The expression of incredulous surprise remained on Helen's face. Ralph found it harder and harder to look at. It made him feel sick to his stomach. Ralph? What happened? Was it an accident? He turned his head and saw Bill McGovern standing at the edge of the parking lot. He was wearing one of his natty blue shirts with the iron's creases still on the sleeves and holding one of his long-fingered, oddly delicate hands up to the shade of his eyes. He looked strange, somehow naked that way, but Ralph had no time to think about why, which was happening. It was no accident, he said. She's been beaten. Here, take the kid. He held Natalie out to McGovern, who at first shrank back and then took the baby. Natalie began immediately to shriek again. McGovern looked like someone who has just been handed an overfilled airsick bag. He held her out at his arm's length with her feet dangling. Behind him, a small crowd was beginning to gather. Many of them, teenage kids in baseball uniforms on their way home from an afternoon game at the field around the corner. They were staring at Helen's puffed and bloody face with unpleasant avidity, and Ralph found himself thinking of the Bible story about the time that Noah had gotten drunk, the good sons who had looked away from the naked old man lying in his tent, the bad one who had looked. Gently he replaced Sue's arm with his own. Helen's good eye rolled back to him. She said his name more clearly this time, more positively, and the gratitude Ralph heard in her blurry voice made him feel like crying. Sue, take the baby. Bill doesn't have a clue. She did, folding that gently and expertly into her arms. McGovern gave her a grateful smile, and Ralph suddenly realized what was wrong with the way he looked. McGovern wasn't wearing the Panama hat, which seemed as much a part of him, in the summertime at least, as the wind on the bridge of his nose. Hey, mister, what happened? One of the baseball kids asked. Nothing that's any of your business, Ralph said. Looks like she went a few rounds with Riddick Bowie. Nah, Tyson, one of the other baseball kids said. And incredibly, there was laughter. Get out of here, Ralph shouted at them, suddenly furious. Go peddle your papers. Mind your business. They shuffled back a few steps, but no one left. It was blood they were looking at, and not on a movie screen. Helen, can you walk? Yes, she said. Think so. He led her carefully around the door and into the Red Apple. She moved slowly, shuffling from foot to foot, like an old woman. The smell of sweat and spent adrenaline was baking out of her pores in a sour reek, and Ralph felt his stomach turn over again. It wasn't the smell, not really. It was the effort to reconcile this Helen with the pert and pleasantly sexy woman he had spoken to yesterday while he worked on her flower beds. Ralph suddenly remembered something else about yesterday. Helen had been wearing blue shorts, cut quite high, and he had noticed a couple of bruises on her legs. A large yellow blotch far up on the left thigh, a fresher, darker smudge on the right calf. He walked Helen toward the little office area behind the cash register. He glanced up into the convex, anti-theft mirror mounted in the corner and saw McGovern holding the door for Sue. Lock the door, he said over his shoulder. Gee, Ralph, I'm not supposed to. Just for a couple minutes, Ralph said. Please. Well, okay, I guess. Ralph heard the snick of the bolt being turned as he eased Helen into the hard plastic contour chair behind the woodery desk. He picked up the telephone and punched the button marked 911. Before the phone could ring, on the other end, a blood-streaked hand reached out and pushed down with a gray disconnect button. Ralph. She swallowed with an obvious effort and tried again. Don't. Yes, Ralph said. I'm going to. No, it was fear he saw in her one good eye, and nothing dull about it. No, she said. Please, Ralph, don't. She looked past him and held out her hands again. Humble, pleading, the look on her beaten face made Ralph wince with dismay. Ralph, she asked. She wants the baby. I know, go ahead. Sue handed Natalie to Helen, and Ralph watched as the baby, a little over a year old now, he was pretty sure, put her arms around her mother's neck and her face against her mother's shoulder. Helen kissed the top of Nat's head. It clearly hurt her to do this, but she did it again, and then again. Looking down at her, Ralph could see blood rimmed into the faint creases on the nape of Helen's neck like dirt. As he looked at this, he felt the anger begin to pulse again. It was Ed, wasn't it? He asked. Of course it was. You didn't hit the cutoff button on the phone when somebody tried to call 911 if you had been beaten up by a total stranger, but he had to ask. Yes, she said. Her voice was no more than a whisper. The answer a secret imparted into the fine cloud of her baby daughter's hair. Yes, it was Ed, but you can't call the police. She looked up now, and good eye full of fear and misery. Please don't call the police, Ralph. I can't bear to think of Natalie's dad in jail for Helen burst into tears. Natalie goggled at her mother for a moment in comic surprise and then joined her. Oh, poor baby. It's so sad. Alright, so we're going to leave off there, I think. For the evening, I don't want to start a whole new section and not be able to finish. I'm kind of curious, though. What's happening next? Ralph the governor asked hesitantly, do you want me to get her some Tylenol or something? Better not, he said. We don't know what's wrong with her, how bad she might be hurt. His eyes shifted to the show window, not wanting to see what was out there, hoping not to and seeing it anyway. Covered faces lined up all down to the place where the beer cooler cut off the view. Some of them were cupping their hands to the sides of their faces to cut the glare. What should we do, you guys? Sue asked. She was looking at the gawkers and picking nervously at the hem of the red apple duster employees had to wear. If the company finds out I lock the door during business hours, I'm apt to lose my job. Helen tugged at his hand. Please, Ralph, she repeated, only it came out. Peace, Ralph, through her swollen lips. Don't call anybody. Ralph looked at her uncertainly. He had seen a lot of women wearing a lot of bruises over the course of his life, and a couple, although not many, in all honesty, who had been beaten much more severely than Helen. It hasn't always seemed this grim, though. His mind and morals had been formed at a time when people believed that what went on between husband and wife behind the closed doors of their marriage was their business, and that included the man who hit with his fists and the woman who cut with her tongue. You couldn't make people behave, and meddling into their affairs, even with the best of intentions, all too often turned friends into enemies. Alright, I'm gonna have to stop there. I hope it calls, though, because that's redonkulous. Redonkulous. Alright, guys, well, let's turn this up just a little bit. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. It was a pleasure having you and reading to you. Really digging this book. I hope you are too. Thank you to all of our friends on We Are Paradox Media's Facebook, KPNR Radio, Twitter, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. I had a wonderful time this evening, and I can't wait to do it again tomorrow night. Actually, next weekend. Maybe some more trippy TikToks and more story time. I don't know. Who knows? Something else might come up. Until next time, nighty night, love and light. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Please don't work too hard this week. Don't take life too seriously. Enjoy every moment you have, because the next moment is not promised. I'll see you back here. Same time, same place. Night night, love and light.